This podcast is presented by Skies Magazine. If you're interested in the Canadian aviation industry, Skies is your go-to multimedia resource for the latest news, in-depth features, stunning photography, and insightful video coverage. Whether you're an aviation professional or enthusiast, Skies is dedicated to keeping you informed and bringing your passion for aviation to life. Visit skiesmag.com to learn more and subscribe to stay updated on all things Canadian aviation.
Fuel and ignition switches on. RPM switches set. TD switches normal. Doors and hatches closed. Light out. Strobe light on. Restart check is complete. Clear left. Engineers, start number 2. Starting 2. Wind 310 Pilot Project Podcast. Clear takeoff. Runway 31 left.
All right, we're ready for departure here at the Pilot Project Podcast, the best source for stories and advice from RCAF and mission aviation pilots, brought to you by Skies Magazine. I'm your host, Brian Morrison. With me today for the conclusion of our 3-part series is Major Ian Wookey, a TACL pilot on the CH-47 Chinook and executive assistant to Chief Air and Space Force Development in Ottawa, Ontario. Ian, thank you once again for coming back to this third and final part of the series.
Hey, it's great to be back with you, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity to share the story.
Listeners can check out part 1 and 2 to hear about the slow deterioration of the situation in Afghanistan, culminating in the fall of Kabul and the evacuation of the U.S. Embassy there. For this episode, we'll be talking about Ian's experiences as the last Canadian in Afghanistan, as well as his on-the-ground view of Operation Allies Refuge. So, at this point, you've completed the evacuation of the embassy. The airfield is relatively secure, and now it's time to evacuate the people who are actually on the airfield proper and get all these people out of the country.
Yeah, so this is where the mission kind of turns from security to evacuation. We managed to retain U.S. control of the airfield, and by the 17th, we actually had other non-NATO countries start flowing into the AO to support their own missions for evacuation. So it, as we look at it, Operation Allies Refuge as an American operation was, how do we get these thousands of people, entitled personnel, out of Afghanistan, and how do we move them safely from Afghanistan to America or Afghanistan to a safe location. But it wasn't just the Americans that were doing that. The Canadians were doing it. All of our partner nations were doing it. Anybody who had a vested interest in that country or any sort of diplomatic mission in that country were starting to flow into the AO.
Right.
Again, it was almost a callback to Bagram and seeing just heavy lift aircraft everywhere as we were doing the retrograde. This time it became pick your country's C-17 or A400M or C-130 military transport plane. Now we're bringing civilian transport planes now that we had the airfield secure and we had some tactical air traffic control set back up again so that we could flow people in. And now we're bringing people in to support the evacuation mission. And now it becomes a challenge of space on the airfield. So how do you actually manage dozens and dozens of cargo planes and passenger planes coming onto the airfield, all to do the same thing, but not all in close coordination with each other? So that was what we started to be able to affect was, okay, how do we help manage, being an aviation task force, how do we help manage kind of the aviation movements on the ground? And the units that had flowed in from the US brought a little bit of expertise. They brought some aviation folks, they brought some planners who were actually able to help coordinate this. And now our task force was trying to manage it from a level of, hey, we're familiar with this AO. We've been on this airfield for a few months. Like we know how to operate here. How can we help enable the missions of these other nations? So whether it was one of our operations staff marshaling the German aircraft around our ramp to make sure that they had space to park around our helicopters, or whether it was sending another planner rep over to the U.S. Marine Corps HQ where they had kind of set up the air cell to start managing the inflow of personnel. Because when they came in, like we didn't know what the security situation was when this contingency force came in. So the 82nd brought artillery, they brought vehicles, they brought people, like they brought equipment to actually sustain a fight because we didn't know whether we would have to.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, we really didn't have to. It was relatively early on, probably the first day, sometime on the 16th, when we got confirmation that there was an agreement with the Taliban and that we were now not, I wouldn't say partners or allies, but we were now working in coordination with the Taliban to make sure that we could have successful operations on the airfield, which was a complete mindset shift from what we've been doing for the last 20 years, right?
Yeah.
But it was a pragmatic agreement, I'd say, on both sides, because we had a vested interest in making sure that we could safely and securely get everybody out of the country, and they had a vested interest in making sure that we safely got out of the country so that there was no risk of bringing further forces to bear or potentially reoccupying spaces that we'd left previously, right?
Yeah.
So that was a unique challenge to present to some of the folks on the ground and some of our crews. And I mean, it was not an easy situation to be in, especially for the force protection folks, for the 82nd troops who were actually securing the perimeter of the airfield, where they were watching the Taliban execute civilians on the external perimeter of the wall.
Oh man.
Where there were daily firefights going on in and around the perimeter, right? It was the security situation was not better, but it at least stabilized to a point where we could execute some operations from inside the airfield. Once we were able to kind of secure ourselves inside the airfield is when we started the evacuation operations. And that was like a little bit of like good news, a little bit of purpose in what we were doing once we got to that phase of the mission.
So the evacuation actually begins. What were the Chinooks doing in these following days?
So now that we had the security situation on the airfield somewhat stabilized and it was functional, right? We were able to flow some aircraft in and we were able to flow aircraft out. The Marine Corps and the SP MAGTF have been given the mission to do some of the security processing, bringing the entitled civilians onto the airfield. The 82nd still had security of the perimeter. Our kind of U.S. Forces Afghanistan task force that was still there was not subordinate to the 82nd that had come in, even though we were from the same division, because we were still part of the original kind of diplomatic security mission. So we started operating in support of kind of the U.S. Forces Afghanistan mission, which was to fly to areas outside the perimeter of the airfield and pick up some entitled personnel who were being staged at offsite locations. So there were certain people who were being contacted by American personnel to be able to get to safe locations outside of Kabul, where we would then be able to pick them up in a Chinook and bring them back to the airfield without having them have to fight through the streets of Kabul, the Taliban checkpoints, to be able to actually get back to the airfield to be evacuated. So over the course of about 8 days, from the 17th, 18th until the 24th, 25th, we were flying 3 Chinooks a day pretty routinely out to locations outside of Kabul to be able to pick up a number of entitled civilian personnel, bring them back to the airfield. We were doing several hundred a day, to a point where I think the the final tally was just shy of the 10,000 mark. I think we got about 9,800 people on our 3 Chinooks coming back to the airfield. Now that's a bit of a logistical challenge in itself. As I said, the Chinooks only got about 30 seats. At this point in the mission, we were not necessarily putting in people in seats. We were kind of folding the seats up on the wall of the helicopter and fitting as many people as we reasonably could into those aircraft. So we were bringing them back to the airfield 80 to 100 at a time per aircraft.
Wow.
Which is it's pretty unique in terms of the missions we've been doing, but it wasn't wild considering at that time some of the C-17s that were flying evacuation missions out of Kabul were taking 400 to 600 people at a time as well. Right, when then they're typically not taking more than 150. So everybody was being asked to operate a little bit outside their comfort zone and do some demanding things in support of the bigger mission.
You mentioned that these fleets are operating kind of way outside of their norms in terms of the amount of people they're carrying and crew rest and all these types of things. Can you describe some of the challenges encountered during the evacuation?
Yeah, some of the biggest challenges during the evacuation is just the scale of what was happening. I mean, it's one of the largest evacuations, if not the largest in history, as far as we can tell. It was a worldwide mobilization of militaries and infrastructure and support facilities. Because when you think of a non-combatant evacuation operation, and we look at it in a military context, within it's not just the act of evacuating someone; it's actually getting them from the place where they are through a secure processing zone to a point of embarkation to some sort of temporary safe haven where they can then go for onward movement to an ultimate destination, right? And when you consider in the context of the Afghan evacuation, specifically Allies Refuge in the American construct, because that's what I'm familiar with, the movement of people in and out of a landlocked country is a logistical challenge. The only way to move them out was by aircraft. And the security situation was such that civilian aircraft were not being chartered to go in there. So it was military and government aircraft, mostly C-17s. Almost every C-17 in the world was rerouted to help this mission.
That's crazy.
All of those crews were put on wild schedules in various locations of the world to make sure you could get from a staging location in the Middle East into Kabul and then back. And even that in itself, any of those staging locations that were being used were kind of at the maximum range that those aircraft were capable of moving without fueling. So it was a challenge too to get them into the AO with sufficient fuel to be able to take a full load of passengers, which, as I said, was 400 to 600 people, and then move them back to wherever they came from, hundreds of miles away. It's a logistical nightmare. And then when you look at it from the perspective of, okay, where are those people moving to? Several of them flowed through Qatar, through the airbase at Al Udeid. And there were periods where we had to stop the evacuation outflow because the location of the aircraft were landing, I couldn't handle them anymore. All of the people that we were evacuating out of Kabul were just getting stuck at whatever their next stop at the temporary safe haven was.
Wow.
There were some security instances at Al Udeid where you had an aircraft land and you had panicked civilians opening emergency doors while the aircraft were taxiing and flooding out onto the runway.
Oh, wow.
When you consider what it takes to pack 600 people into the back of an aircraft for 4 to 6 hours of flying time to get them out of the AO, and those aircraft are not built with latrines on board, so you might only have one bathroom. What kind of sanitary situation are you now dealing with, right? So before those aircraft could then flow back into the AO, there was a level of sanitization that had to be done to those aircraft to make sure that they were safe and usable for the next mission. And then just pack the hours on it. Like, aircraft take maintenance. So the more hours you put on the aircraft, the more maintenance you need to do. Well, at least in our case with the Chinooks that we were flying and the Apaches that we were flying, I mean, at one point, our Apaches flew for over 36 hours straight. We just had crews swapping in and out, doing 8 to 12-hour shifts, being airborne to support this mission.
That's crazy.
Like, that's fatiguing on the airframes, and we had limited capacity to be able to do maintenance. Once the Department of State left, there was no fuel to replenish the airfield supply of fuel. So, like, from a real life support perspective, we were dealing with the fuel and ammunition we had on hand. So we were back to kind of like whiteboard math of how many sorties we were flying and how much fuel we were pulling out of the in-ground tanks on the airfield to be able to put into these aircraft to support the missions we were doing, to make sure that we weren't about to run out of fuel, because there was no resupply coming. Like, there was no way to get more fuel into that airfield with the security situation the way it was. All of the contractors who provided, whether they were local or hired or whatever, they were gone. Like, they were some of the first people evacuated. So how do you keep the lights on and the water running at the airfield, like, let alone in the city, in that kind of situation too? So that we're at a point where even within our task force, we had one intrepid young lieutenant pilot who found a random Army Corps of Engineers contractor who managed to miss his evacuation flight. And the two of them were going around the airfield, making sure that the water pumps were still running, making sure that the power supply was still functioning, and servicing the generators. Like, people were acting way outside of their role just to make sure that things were still happening and this operation was still going.
Wow. So
that the challenges were absolutely insane in terms of, like, the scope and scale of what this operation was trying to achieve.
Amidst all these challenges, how did NATO help with the evacuation?
As you look at the ISAF mission, like the International Security Assistance Force that was present in Afghanistan, NATO had been in Afghanistan from the beginning, right? It wasn't just an American mission, it was a NATO mission. So all of them had different vested interests in the success or failure of Afghanistan as a country, right? So all of these different countries each wanted to make sure that they could provide to their diplomatic mission or the civilians that they'd worked with or their own entitled personnel to make sure that they could get in and conduct their own evacuation operation. So NATO proper was sending staff in to help do immigrant visa processing. All of the countries were sending their own aircraft in. But again, everything was happening so quickly, and the security situation was such that there was really no time to wait, that there was not really, well, there was no NATO headquarters left in country. So there was very limited ability to actually be able to do any sort of high level coordination. So every partner country was trying to flow their own aircraft in to get their own entitled personnel out. And it was one of those situations where you really just had to deal with the situation on the ground as it occurred. And there was no level of advanced planning that was going to disconnect that. So really the north side of the airfields became a staging ground. The couple of the aprons that had previously kind of been the passenger terminal area or the housing lodging area for the NATO mission on HKIA really just became a processing facility. So people coming onto the airfield, they generally had some level of paperwork or documentation to suggest that they were supposed to be there. and they were then kind of being individually sorted by the countries that were on the ground, or the groups that were on the ground, the interested parties, who were then doing kind of their own processing to make sure that they were getting the people that they had promised to help on the planes that were on the ground. The bigger challenge was actually sorting through the people who were outside the fence. And this is where I wasn't there. Like I was there, but I wasn't at the perimeter, right? That wasn't my mission. I was not in the boots of the Marine Corps people who had to, like those troops standing at the gate who had to try and differentiate between the 600 people who were coming up and waving papers in their faces and saying whether or not they're entitled. Like it was a logistical nightmare on the ground, because there's only so many ways to access the airfield. But we had, from a force protection perspective, we kind of had to like really manage the flow of personnel through each of the gates that were actually open to accept these refugees and the entitled personnel. So we had to do rotating closures of the gates just to try and manage the flow of people in and out. And it was not an easy task at all. And I encourage anyone who enjoys listening to this podcast, I'm sure listens to other podcasts. There's a School of War is a really good, just like professional military development podcast I listen to. And at the end of August, they did an interview with one of the Marine Corps company commanders who was on the ground, actually at the gate, doing that, trying to do that differentiation between who gets in and who doesn't. And it's a really fascinating interview to hear it from that perspective of how you're actually going to manage that situation on the ground. I don't want to say we were lucky, but our mission set was such that we didn't necessarily have to do that differentiation. We were typically, when we were doing the evacuation with our task force, we were given people who had already been processed to put on our Chinook as like, these people are going to the airfield to be evacuated. They've been vetted. So we didn't have the same level of concern in trying to figure out who gets to be where.
CAF Outlooks is Canada's 3-day conference where the Canadian Armed Forces and industry shape the direction of defense and security. From April 7th to 9th, CAF leaders speak directly to industry on current projects and future procurement needs, with each day focused on one environment: Army, Navy, and Air Force. The CAF Outlooks series is presented by CADC, the Canadian Association of Defense and Security Industries. Learn more or register today at defenseandsecurity.ca/CAF.
So during all this chaos, you managed to get some help from a Canadian friend. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting part of the story that's probably always going to stick with me. In the middle of all these evacuations while they were going on, there was no way to flow anything in to Kabul, right? Any aircraft that were coming into Kabul were coming in with a purpose to conduct some sort of evacuation operation, and they were flowing in empty and they were leaving full. Like there was just no feasible way to bring more people or equipment into Kabul without undoing all of the planning that we're doing to try and clear the airfield. Well, the problem we had was one of our aircraft had a component that broke that we actually needed to be able to fly, and all of our maintenance parts and all of the components of the battalion that had retrograded Afghanistan that weren't part of the force that stayed forward in Kabul had gone back to Kuwait, where they were staged and waiting to receive us when we eventually left the country. And they had all of our maintenance components. We had no dedicated airflow to get back into the country. It was kind of like U.S. Air Force was doing the evacuation piece and we were managing the situation on the ground. But it just so happens that the Canadian mission was also located in Kuwait. And I was able, through just kind of serendipity, to know the acting ATF commander on the ground in Kuwait, who I contacted on WhatsApp, connected her with one of our crew chiefs who had the component that we needed to move. They managed to link up, and on one of the Canadian flights that was coming in to bring out Canadian evacuees, they managed to get this part onto the aircraft and flown in within 24 hours so that we could get our Chinook back in the air. Another interesting piece of that story is when I was standing on the ground waiting to collect the part, our C-17 landed, and I went on board to say hi and thanks to the crew. And the aircraft commander flying that aircraft was an old RMC classmate and guy I did pilot training with. So it was just like a really weird kind of like funny seeing you here moment when we were able to actually effect some good for the mission and do a little bit of collaboration between the Canadian American forces. And that was really how the whole evacuation went. It was a lot of low-level coordination of people just kind of making things happen despite the chaos around them.
Wow.
And I really appreciate that, because had we not got that component, I'm not convinced that aircraft we would have been suffering to actually evacuate as many people as we did. I'm not sure if that aircraft would have made it home. So,
and actually, I think we can name that person who helped you from the deputy. What was her position again? Sorry, deputy of the Air Task Force.
She was the deputy task force commander, actually acting Air Task Force commander at the time, because I think the Air Task Force commander was out of the country. But that's Lieutenant Colonel Mylène Lavallee, who's at 17 Wing in Winnipeg now.
Yeah, and the reason I say we can name her is because I actually happen to have hosted a podcast for the RCAF while I was still in one of their first episodes of the RCAF Jump Seat podcast, where you can hear all about her experience during this evacuation from her perspective. So that's kind of a cool intersection of topics and people. That's really neat. So how many people were evacuated during these 9 or so days, and what do you give credit to for this achievement?
Over the course of that week and a half, I think I mentioned, the total number between the embassy of the evacuation and the evacuation that we did as a follow-on task force. Our task force moved just over 10,000 people. But overall, the mission, like Operation Allies Refuge and the other countries, I think the number came out to almost 125,000 people total were moved out in 9 days.
Which is crazy.
So do a little bit of reverse math on that. You're talking about probably 12,000 people a day being flown on military aircraft out of Kabul in the middle of one of the most tenuous security situations that you can imagine. It was no small achievement. And then to think about, I mentioned earlier, 125,000 people getting to their ultimate destination. It was literally a worldwide effort. I know from an American perspective, some of the U.S. bases in Europe, air bases in Germany, and other locations for the Brits, some of their staging locations in the UK, like these bases were very quickly inundated with people on very short notice, and the effort it took at a local level at all these bases worldwide, and then even back to the US and Canada, like trying to receive all of these people in such rapid succession and move them from one location to another without leaving people in a location without any sort of support for an extended duration of time. It's just a testament to how capable people are when they get focused on a mission like that.
The logistics of this mission, of this evacuation, is hard to comprehend. It's literally moving an entire large city of people out of a country in 9 days.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing to look back on it and acknowledge what was accomplished.
So what eventually brought a stop to the evacuation?
It was the security situation, and I think that's what everybody knew it was going to be eventually. But on the 26th of August, there was a terrorist attack outside the gates of the airfield at Abbey Gate, where a suicide bomber detonated an IED, which ended up killing 13 U.S. service members and dozens and dozens of civilians outside the gate. And that was a really challenging day because we knew from the intelligence picture that there was a risk. We knew that the security situation was such that we could not keep up this level of evacuation indefinitely without inducing some sort of force protection risk. But we'd had a week of success, and there was optimism that we could get through to some sort of end state successfully. And when the bomb went off, everything kind of stopped. Like when that bomb went off at Abbey Gate, the first and foremost was okay, what now? So we spooled up an aircraft to fly over to try and provide any sort of hasty CASEVAC. At that point, they didn't end up needing us at all because most of the casualties had been ground transported back to the medical facility on the airfield. But at that point, it really drove home kind of the level of risk that we were accepting and continuing the evacuation. And the decision was made from the higher levels that the evacuation was not going to continue in the same form that it was at the time. And that really was the turning point where we started to shift the mission set from evacuating as many Afghans as possible to making sure that we as a military force of now probably close to 3,000 troops on the airfield could safely evacuate ourselves. Right. So we kind of had to do a strategic analysis of what assets do we have left to be able to move in, and what's on the ground, and how much airflow do we have left before we reach capacity to make sure that we can get all of the friendly forces out before whatever deadline comes. And at this point, I think the deadline had been shifted now from, it was no longer the 11th of September, but it had been set. The target was the end of August.
So at this point, you're basically starting contingency planning on how to get out of the country. What did that look like?
It looked different for different groups that were on the ground. From a force protection standpoint, the 82nd Airborne troops who were securing the perimeter of the airfield, well, they were looking at, okay, how do we draw down to a minimum viable level to be able to provide force protection until we have to get the last boots off the ground. From the U.S. Marine Corps perspective, who were kind of running the non-combatant evacuation operation, well, that as soon as those evacuation activities ceased and they no longer needed that capability, they were able to kind of just arrange themselves into chocks and flow out of the AO. From an aviation task force perspective level, like from a task force Talon level, we had to shape it as, okay, we can move ourselves out, but we have all these aircraft here. And we had slowly been drawing down aircraft through the evacuation. So some of our UH-60s are retrograded. We retrograded one of the UH-64s. But those Chinooks were still lifting. And in order to move a Chinook by air, you either fly it or you put it in the back of a C-17. And one Chinook fits in the back of one C-17 and not much else. So we had to do a strategic assessment of, is it worth our time to be able to take up this precious airflow of one whole C-17 just for this one Chinook? And that math kind of took place over several days, where we had to assess, okay, how many people do we have on the ground? Like what equipment should or should not be left behind? because people aren't being left behind, right? Like that's priority one. So make sure we have enough airflow to get the people out.
For sure.
So over the course of the next few days, we had to do analysis kind of at our level to decide, okay, do we or do we not have airflow? If we do have airflow, the answer is easy. We can just we can start tearing down the Chinooks to be able to fit on the C-17. But if we don't have airflow, well, what are our other options? Well, one, we can fly them out of the country. Okay, we'll fly them to where? Afghanistan geographically is not in a really accessible location, especially for any sort of seaport. So we don't have the legs to get them to a ship. So we're going to fly them across a border. Okay, well, which border? We're probably not going southwest to Iran. Are there options in Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan? Right? Like there's like what are we going to do and where are we going to go? And that what level of coordination can be done between governments to allow us to cross an international border, acknowledging that the Afghan Air Force that flew out 10 days ago didn't make it across an international border because of some of the air defenses. So another option is, okay, we leave the equipment behind. Well, we're not going to leave functioning equipment for the Taliban. So are we just going to destroy the aircraft and leave it? So what do we have to do to be able to prepare to destroy those aircraft? So we were creating contingencies where we had enough destructive material to be able to make sure that if we were to leave equipment behind, that it would be adequately destroyed and denied to anybody who wanted to use it next, right? Ultimately, and lucky for us, we managed to get sufficient airflow into a point where we were able to get all of our aircraft out on C-17s and managed to get them back to Kuwait, where we could then get them for onward movement back stateside. So a couple tenuous days there where we really didn't know what came next, and we were planning for all eventual outcomes. Luckily, we did manage to get enough airlift to get those aircraft out.
So you left on a C-17 with the second last Chinook from Afghanistan on the 30th of August, 24 hours before the Americans withdrew. Can you describe the day you left Afghanistan?
It was a lot like all of the days that came before it. To be completely honest, that last 2 weeks in the country was a bit of Groundhog Day, just trying to figure out where aircraft were going and who was getting on what chalk, and what could reasonably leave at what time with what level of support and what force protection had to stay behind. The chalk guy ended up leaving on, so I think that the day for me was characterized by a little bit of it was equal parts concern and relief. A little bit of relief because I spent the day helping tear down that Chinook. So it was all hands on deck, right, to be able to disassemble the Chinook to a level where we could actually push it in the back of the C-17. Acknowledging that we were getting the majority of our people out on those last chalks with those aircraft, and that they were going to be safely on their way to somewhere a little more secure. A little bit of trepidation and concern because I wasn't on the last chalk, right? And I wanted to be there to make sure that we could still get everybody out at a reasonable time. But at that point, it's not for me to question who's going on which chalk, right? Like we're trying to make sure that we've got the right combination of qualification, leadership, and expertise kind of distributed among the retrograde activities.
Yeah.
And then we finally loaded up in the middle of the night. So I never really got to, it was the back of a C-17. There's not really any windows and it's middle of the night. So you kind of picture this aircraft taking off and going over the horizon with the sun setting in the background. I have no memory of that. I have memories of sharing a few hugs and high fives with the folks that I was on that flight with, getting out to be able to get into Kuwait.
Did you feel a sense of relief at leaving? Like, you've talked about Obviously, that sense of like, I wish I was there to make sure everyone gets out. But was there a sense of relief of like, okay, wow, we're out of this situation?
When I landed in Kuwait, there was never really there was always that moment where, like, I've been around aviation long enough to know that things can go wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like, something mechanically breaks on takeoff, and you know that you're either aborting the takeoff or you're going to the alternate, and taking off out of Kabul. Well, the alternate's Kabul. So it was really not until we were several hours into the flight and kind of knew we were on final approach for Kuwait when you could really start to feel a sense of like relief, um, relief that I could, and not even for me necessarily, but like relief that I could land in Kuwait and actually like call my family,
Mm-hmm.
which I hadn't really been able to do for the days leading up to being able to leave. And that it was a tough balance, right? Trying to keep people informed and trying not to keep people informed while being focused on the mission. Like, there was not a lot of communication with the outside world for those 2 weeks, good, bad, or otherwise.
How did your family handle that? How did your wife handle that with kind of knowing like the media has been covering it at this point? So, how are they handling that back home?
Uh, I'm sure it was stressful. I think that was probably because there was so much media attention. There was no way to get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
So the only thing that anybody back home was probably getting was those wild images on the news of people flooding the gates of the airfield, the news about the ID blast, um, the news about the evacuation deadline. So it could not have been easy or stressful on them. Like, they knew that I was still there, that I was still working, that I was still kind of in the middle of the mission. But it probably wasn't until I was out of the country and back in September, that we could actually kind of have those conversations and recognize that I was going to be coming home at some point.
Yeah, which must have been a huge relief for your family. And there was actually some waiting in Kuwait, right? I think you made it back to the US by Christmas.
Yeah, there was a period of about 3 or 4 months in Kuwait, because if, like, think about a big picture, right? Like, we are one task force of several dozen hundred that are all kind of stuck now in this weird post Afghanistan mission, um, fallout. So if you think about, our mission was to retrograde Afghanistan. Well, the initial plan was, okay, retrograde it where? Kind of the staging location that was chosen for our battalion was, okay, go to Kuwait. But now we're in Kuwait with aircraft and people, and all of the airflow in the world had just been completely sapped. So there was no airflow left to like move anybody anywhere. Everybody was trying to reconstitute in some location. The base we were at in Kuwait was a little bit overflowing with people who were not supposed, like, we weren't necessarily supposed to be there at that point. So there had been no planning done to put a battalion's worth of aircraft and people in that location. And then, like, the real life support of how do you manage that? How do you flow them out? How do you get the aircraft back? We didn't really have any sort of logistical tail set up there to be able to successfully do any of the maintenance on the aircraft or to be able to prep the aircraft to get home. So it took us a few months to really get settled and reoriented toward redeployment, to a point where we're waiting on airlift, waiting on sea lift to be able to get that equipment home. So the mission didn't end the day we left Afghanistan. The mission really didn't end until everybody was back home, because once you're redeployed to a staging location, well, now you're planning the redeployment from the staging location, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was still a lot of work to be done. So yeah, I don't think I didn't get home until I think it was late November, early December.
Okay. So you said you got home late November, early December. You get home, the dust settles a bit. How did you feel looking back on everything you've been through? Did you have time to process it, or has it just sort of been compressed into this operational experience that you went through and it's done and that's that?
I'd say it's a little bit of both. I mean, when we redeployed November, December, I mean, the battalion went back to work at Fort Bragg, right? So you were still got to go back to work with the same people I was seeing every day through kind of January through March. The challenge for me was about the same time I landed back in the US. I was getting a posting message to move back to Canada. So as I said, I think last interview, it was supposed to be a 3-year exchange posting. Because of the deployment, it ended up being extended to 4. So I was in the US from summer of 2018 until middle of 2022. So I kind of came home in January, February. We were starting to make plans for actually leaving the US and how to set up a handover for my successor at Fort Bragg, and then come home to start my next job back at 450. So didn't really have a lot of time to dwell on what had happened. Had some time to take a bit of an extended Christmas leave period to take a break and reset personally. But it really just exists now as a bit of an operational memory of a pretty chaotic period where you were forced to get comfortable in an uncomfortable situation, and I've been able to take that forward with me in my career.
If you could leave our listeners with a final thought, something that they should know, what would you say about this whole experience in Afghanistan?
I would say that the uncomfortable situations will occur. You're always going to be faced with decisions that you don't have the answer to. You're always going to be operating in an environment with incomplete information. That hasn't changed since I've come home. Even in my new job, I'm dealing with incomplete information all the time, trying to find the best answer to the question I'm faced with. And whether you're leaning on somebody who's got more experience than you, like a mentor or family member or a colleague, you really just have to understand that the decisions you make are going to be with incomplete information, and you're not always going to be comfortable in the situation you're put in. But with the understanding that your training has got you to a point where you've been put in a position for success, and acknowledging that you're not alone in that, like the whole military is team environment. Mm-hmm. You're never operating in isolation. So I just suggest that even in the middle of the chaos, even when it looks like everything's falling apart, you're still surrounded by people who have your back and can help you out.
Yeah, I like that. No one is an island, especially when it comes to the military, and leaning on your peers, leaning on your mentors, it's all really crucial. So yeah, that's great. So Ian, that does it for our chat on your time with the 82nd Airborne in the last days of Afghanistan. I just want to thank you so much, not only for being here today, but for all the important and dangerous work you've done, and for taking the time to walk us through this story. I don't think it's really been told from a Canadian perspective, and I just really appreciate you taking that time. So thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to you and share some experience with listeners.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thank you. All right, that wraps up our 3-part series with Major Ian Wookey and his experiences as the last Canadian in Afghanistan. Next week, we'll be taking a break for a much-needed vacation. The following week, the excitement continues as we sit down with Rock Vega. We'll hear about his time instructing at Moose Jaw and Saudi Arabia, his current job flying the CC-295 Kingfisher, and the dramatic and exciting story of his ejection in a CT-155 Hawk. Do you have any questions or comments about anything you've heard in this show? Would you or someone you know make a great guest, or do you have a great idea for a show? You can reach out to us at thepilotprojectpodcast@gmail.com or on all social media at podpilotproject. And be sure to check out that social media for lots of great videos of our RCAF and mission aviation aircraft. As always, we'd like to thank you for tuning in and ask for your help with the big three. That's like and follow us on social media, share with your friends, and follow and rate us 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. Keep the blue side up. See ya!
Engineer, shut down all 4.
Shutting down all 4 engines.